Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. We remind our internet viewers that questions or comments can be sent at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And for those in-house, we do ask that last courtesy check that cell phones have been muted as we prepare to begin. It's always helpful for the speakers as well as for recording the program. We will, of course, post the program later this week following today's presentations for everyone's future reference. Our host today is Dr. James J. Carafano. He is Vice President for our Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy Studies. He also serves as the E.W. Richardson Fellow. He's a graduate of West Point and a 25-year veteran of the Army. He is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, and the Institute of World Politics. He has also served as a visiting professor at the National Defense University. He serves on the Board of Trustees of the Marine Corps University Foundation and advisory boards for the West Point Center on Oral History and the Hamilton Society, as well as Operation Renewed Hope. Please join me in welcoming Jim Carafano. Jim?
So I am so super excited about this because this is a research institution, and I always tell my graduate students, when you do research, you actually shouldn't know the answer to the question that you're asking. That's the whole kind of idea why they call it research. So I have a hypothesis, and so what I wanted to do is to bring together some smart guys and test my hypothesis. And this is my hypothesis, is that the Iran agreement actually should serve as a real focal point of what I think the future choices really are in American foreign policy. So I think that the deal represents the choices, what the real choices are. And why I think that's important is because I think the perception of what the choices are have changed very significantly over the last decade. You know, we came out of the Cold War with this kind of breakdown of strategic consensus of who are we, what is our purpose in the world, and what are we trying to do? And what really kind of mark the right and left limits of what's natural and what makes sense and what Americans will accept and support and believe in, right? And we really have been on this journey really since 1985, trying to figure out what that path is. What's the new Monroe Doctrine? What's the new America does not have enduring alliances? What's the new we're going to contain these guys? What's the thing, right? And I think what happened over a period somewhere between 2005 and 2008, the choice lapsed into this myopic and cartoonish thing is, well, our choices are simple. We either sit at home and do nothing, or we invade the rest of the world. So the choices were American foreign policy is either isolationist or it is interventionist, and that's your choice. And it's a very cartoonish choice, and I think the administration kind of played its cards well in saying, well, obviously neither one of those is the right thing. So the right answer is the middle course, which was defined in different versions as don't be stupid, okay, or doing something, right? And I think that in a sense we don't agree. I think there's great controversy over what President Obama's course and strategy and policy are. But I think everybody does agree that the answer is I'm not voting for the isolationists or the interventionists, and we don't see the starkness of foreign policy as a choice between isolationism and interventionism. So what is the choice? And here's where I think the conceptualization of the problem comes in, is because most of us over the course of our lifetimes who have dealt with foreign policy, international relations, largely kind of change the choice of approach to the world between what's been referred to as kind of realist theory or realism, where power is kind of the operating instrument of how relations are and how you do things, and the acquisition of power and the protection and security of power is the animating force. And the opposing, another theory, which comes under a lot of different titles, sometimes it's called idealism, although it has nothing to do with being idealistic, just like realism has nothing to do with being realistic. It's also called structuralism or neoliberalism. So it's got different names, but this notion of two different approaches, one that's focused on the acquisition and the protection of power, and the other that's focused on norms and structures and establishing rules of the road. But I don't think that kind of, and structuralism is normally associated with progressives, and realism is normally associated with conservatives. And somehow I don't think that divide works anymore either, because we see in the foreign policy debates, and we certainly saw them in the Iran deal, we see them in the debate over Syria, how do you deal with Russia and China, that we often find people from different camps winding up in the same place. So we find structuralists and realists who both think the answer is accommodating with China or accommodating with Russia or withdrawing from the world. And we find people on the other side saying, well, we have a responsibility to protect, so we should be invading people to protect them. So I'm not sure IR theory represents the stark political choices or in terms of the path forward. So the question that I pose to our two panelists is, help us define what is the choice that not just the American people are going to make in the next election, but the choice being presented to them between the two paths. What do they represent? And how does the Iran deal really reflect one path, and what is the alternative? And so to do that, I have two great friends and two scholars and practitioners who I know have thought a lot about this and who are probably more thoughtful on this than really kind of anybody I know. So fortunately, one of them just sits downstairs, so that was kind of the easy part. So Kim Holmes, for many years, had my job. He was the vice president ran foreign and defense policy and ran our research team. And he served as an assistant secretary of state under George W. Bush. So he's been on both sides. He's a distinguished fellow, so he has a lot of time these days and has done some amazing research and writing, and really just contributed an enormous amount to understanding where we are. And Colin Duick, who is a great friend and a collaborator on many projects that we worked on. He's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an associate professor of policy, government, and international affairs at George Mason University, and perhaps most importantly, has many writings and books, but just published The Obama Doctrine, American Grand Strategy Today, Oxford University Press 2015. So clearly that would, I think, represent at least one of the choices that people are being presented with. And the other thing I want to mention is he's also an advisor to the George Mason Alexander Hamilton Society, which is a terrific young professionals association, and it's involved in universities around the country, which I'm a huge fan of. So I think what we'll do this, I'm going to turn it over to you guys to make whatever remarks or discourse you wish, and then we're going to throw it up into the audience, and we'll do question and answer, and we will try to end promptly at 1 o'clock. So if you have a question, please just raise your hand, and I will recognize you. And if you would just wait for the microphone, because we also put these out on the internet, and we also video them for the future. So that way people can hear your questions and comments. So if you would wait for the microphone, and if you would just state your name and affiliation, that would be awesome. And we'll try to get in as much discourse and discussion as we can before the end of the hour. So I think maybe Colin first, and then Kim. And if you guys want to speak from there or come up to the podium, your choice, and then we'll just kind of we'll jump into Q&A as soon as you guys are done. Fair enough?
Great.
Okay, over to you.
Thank you. Well, that's a good introduction to the topic. I think Jim said a number of things that are really true. There's been a kind of confusion, especially since the end of the Cold War, on what are the essential differences between left and right. There was a moment with the War on Terror where it seemed that Republicans had united on that concept, but obviously after a few years that broke down as a unifying theme. And he's also right in that Obama has presented a kind of false middle. I mean, the choice is not exactly international versus isolationism. It's not exactly realism versus idealism. But there is a clear choice, and I'm just going to take a few minutes to outline what I think the choice is and the historical context, and then I'll hand it over to Kim to say more about this Iran deal specifically. But I want to put this in broader context, pointing to some long-standing differences between left and right in this country. And I think in a way what's happened is we've cycled back to them. That's going to be one of my things. So President Obama has obviously made the Iran deal a centerpiece of his foreign policy legacy. He was willing to put a lot of capital into it. And as you know, Republicans rallied in opposition to this deal along with key Senate Democrats, but because of a prearranged agreement with the White House, they were unable to block it or even to vote in disapproval. Now, what does this recent debate indicate regarding the likely role of foreign policy issues in the presidential election next year? One interesting aspect of the Iran debate was that the more people heard about the Iran deal, the less they liked it. Last spring, most polls showed a majority of Americans in favor of the deal. Yet once the details of it emerged this summer, and proponents as well as critics were given a chance to make their case, a very large number of Republicans, Democrats, and independents were persuaded by the opposition. One typical September poll from the Pew Research Center indicated that only 21% of Americans now approve of the nuclear deal. Another 49% said they disapprove, with the remainder saying no opinion or don't know. An even more striking proportion of 70% say they are skeptical that Iran will uphold its end of the bargain. So you might say the White House won the fight, but they lost the argument. And this is going to have consequences moving forward well beyond the issue of Iran. Just to take a step back, for many years, liberals and conservatives within the U.S. have differed significantly on how to best pursue American interests and values overseas. These differences date back, I would suggest, to the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Starting in the 1970s, political scientists found significant differences between left and right on U.S. foreign policy. Liberals tended, at that time, to be very skeptical regarding the use of force overseas, favoring instead a strong emphasis on multilateral organization, global governance, and non-traditional issues such as the environment. One political scientist called this new perspective accommodationist, as an accurate description of the liberal point of view. Most American liberals in the 70s believed that international cooperation could be encouraged by a more accommodating, peaceful, and diplomatic approach toward America's adversaries, including the Soviet Union. Conservatives never accepted this view. But even during the Carter presidency, there were still plenty of conservative Southern Democrats committed to Cold War anti-communism. So ideological differences between left and right did not always line up with partisan differences between Democrats and Republicans. It wasn't really until the Reagan years that party and ideology began to align more closely on foreign policy issues. Okay, now fast forward to 2015. The basic philosophical division between liberals and conservatives over U.S. foreign policy isn't really all that different. Witness the results of a very revealing study from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, released less than 4 weeks ago. It's called America Divided. According to the Chicago study, while a clear majority of both Democrats and Republicans today support America's broad engagement in the world, they differ on precisely how to do it. Democrats are more likely to emphasize climate change, support for the United Nations, and diplomatic outreach to U.S. adversaries such as Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. Republicans, for their part, are more likely to say the following. Islamic fundamentalism is a critical threat to the United States. Israel plays a positive role within the Middle East. The United States should be willing to provide weapons to Ukraine in its struggle against Russia. American troops should remain in Afghanistan past 2016. China is an economic and military challenge to the United States. And the U.S. should be willing to use force against ISIS, Iran, and/or in defense of Israel. Okay. In other words, conservatives as well as liberals have returned to their traditional postures on foreign policy issues, postures rooted in very deep-seated historical and genuine differences over America's role in the world. Only today, these differences line up with partisan divisions more neatly than they did in the 1970s, because the two parties have realigned so that the Democratic Party is more thoroughly liberal than it once was, while Republicans are more thoroughly conservative. And this is reflected in the foreign policy debate as well. Now, for most years, since these divisions first surfaced over foreign and national security policy, they have tended on balance to benefit Republicans more than Democrats. This was certainly true under Nixon and Reagan, as well as during the 2004 re-election campaign of George W. Bush. Bill Clinton managed to win 2 presidential elections not because he was viewed as superior on foreign and defense issues. If you look at the polls, he was not, but because these issues were simply not salient to most voters during the 1990s. In other words, they weren't voting on those issues. Barack Obama may be viewed as the one great exception to this rule. In 2008, while most Americans respected Senator John McCain's credentials to be commander-in-chief, the average voter, the voter in the middle, was also tired of the Iraq War, disappointed with President Bush, and open to unusually dovish foreign policy arguments from an unconventional Democratic candidate, namely Obama. In 2012, after the successful strike on bin Laden, national security was effectively taken off the table for Republicans once again. a majority of voters were simply in no mood to hear hawkish criticisms of existing policies that year. Now, what's happened during Obama's second term, and especially over the last 12 to 15 months, is that more voters have come to view the president's foreign policy approach as inadequate. And they do not view it as inadequate in the sense that Obama is too aggressive. They view it as inadequate in that they see Obama as too cautious. This, for example, was the finding of a Washington Post ABC News poll from September 2014. When asked what they thought of Obama's foreign policy style, Americans answered in the following way. 53% said too cautious, 10% said too aggressive, 33% said about right. In other words, the position of current New Hampshire frontrunner Bernie Sanders, the socialist from Vermont, that Obama is too aggressive overseas militarily is shared by about 10% of the general public. The mainstream Republican position, on the other hand, that Obama is too cautious, is now shared by a majority of Americans. Any Democratic Party presidential nominee next year, including those who claim to be stronger on national security than the current president, such as Hillary Clinton, will have a hard time winning on national security issues because of what's called retrospective voting. Retrospective voting is the phenomenon whereby approval or disapproval for an incumbent president from the last 4 years can either help or hurt the nominee from the same party, even when the incumbent is no longer on the ballot. We saw that in 2008. We saw it in 1988. We've seen it every time an outgoing president either helps or hurts the nominee from the same party. This year, Obama's overall approval rating is about 45%. This hardly makes Republican success next year inevitable, but it does pose more of a challenge for Democrats in keeping the White House than they might like to think. And now turn to Obama's foreign policy approval ratings. You find they've been stuck at about 39% for 2 years now. In other words, consistently very low. That is to say, to an even greater extent than on domestic issues, voters today are worried by Obama's handling of American foreign policy, and they are ready to hear alternative arguments from the other side. Those like Secretary Clinton or Vice President Biden who participated in the making of the policy will not be particularly well positioned to critique it. Now, the debate over the Iran nuclear deal has been crucial because it's illustrated some very basic, sincere differences between 2 points of view in relation to American foreign policy. I would call them accommodation on the one hand versus resistance or counterpunching on the other. The first view is that the United States should be willing to take significant risks and make significant concessions towards admitted adversaries of the United States, like Iran, in the hope that these concessions might trigger positive domestic and foreign policy changes coming from these regimes. This is the view of most American liberals. It's the sincerely held view of President Obama. That's accommodation. The second view is that such concessions involve undue risk and should be rejected in favor of continued vigilance and pressure against America's international adversaries. This is the view of most conservatives within the United States today. Now, in all probability, the 2016 presidential election will present voters with a clear choice between two distinct foreign policy alternatives, one liberal and one conservative. Neither alternative will be isolationist, and neither, as Jim said, will focus primarily on regime change. The Democratic nominee will likely argue that whatever Obama's mistakes, on balance, he got more right than wrong, and that voters should embrace his foreign policy legacy, including the Iran nuclear deal. The Republican nominee will likely argue that it's time to stop offering diplomatic accommodations to adversaries of the U.S. and instead push back against them using a range of policy tools, including economic sanctions, alliances, and military deterrence. The recent debate over the Iran deal captured, I think, as well as any foreign policy controversy from the Obama era, some essential differences between the views of liberals and conservatives on foreign policy. Voters have now been reminded of those differences. Only next year, unlike the past two presidential elections, I suggest that difference is less likely to favor the Democrats. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Colin. Well, I will be echoing many of the things that Colin just said, perhaps in a different way. But what I'd like to do, sort of taking my homework assignment that Jim gave me, looking at the Iran deal as a microcosm of or a reflection, if you will, of these different perspectives. If you'll just bear with me for a moment, I thought it might be a good thing to kind of very quickly do a review of how Obama and conservatives view the Iran deal and then move from that into the larger discussion. So just a quick review. The differences on the Iran agreement between Obama and conservatives could not be starker. Obama believes that a deal with the Iranians, essentially an embrace of the Iranians, will moderate their behavior. Conservatives believe the opposite. They believe it would only embolden the Iranians to be even more provocative and eventually at some point to even break out of the existing agreement. Obama stakes everything on the theoretical hope of change inside Iran, while conservatives are skeptical, and that skepticism is rooted in essentially an assessment of past behavior, in other words, empirical evidence, not what happens potentially in the future. Obama is relaxed about verifying the agreement. Conservatives think the weaknesses of the verification regime is a fatal flaw. And finally, most importantly, Obama believes that the Vienna Agreement will prevent Iran from actually getting a nuclear weapon, and many conservatives, including this one, doesn't believe that at all. That actually, if you look at the terms of it, it provides a glide path for Iran to get a nuclear weapon, at least in 10 and 15 years, or at least it has the opportunity to do so, if not much sooner if it breaks out of the agreement. Well, you can't get any starker than the differences between those 2 points of view. So how do you account for this chasm? How does the same set of facts produce such wildly different interpretations of these facts? And the answer, as Colin is saying, is essentially in two very different worldviews. At Obama and conservatives see the world of state and power relations fundamentally differently. For starters, Obama sees himself as a progressive idealist. He is constantly pointing to some imagined future where all state conflict is erased by mutual cooperation. You can see this, of course, in his argument about the nuclear deal will induce Iran to change its behavior. It's the fundamental principle behind it. Well, obviously, conservatives don't believe this at all. They are not progressive historicists at all. They tend to see history made by the real decisions of real men and women and not by some mysterious historical force that is always moving in a progressive direction. In other words, conservatives are Madisonians, they're Jeffersonians, they're not Hegelians, and they're certainly not Marxists. Secondly, Obama tends to see American power as part of the world's problem. He essentially sees that there's too much of it, especially American military power. By contrast, conservatives view American power and leadership as indispensable to international peace and stability. And I emphasize that. It's not just about our own security, our own defense. We see it as indispensable not only to the alliance systems, but to international peace and stability. It's a fundamental difference of a way of seeing American power. Obama tends to neglect allies. Conservatives value them as assets, not as liabilities. Obama sees diplomacy and international agreements often as ends in themselves. Conservatives see them as means to an end, essentially to advance and uphold American power, influence, and values so it can uphold this order of international peace and stability that I mentioned. Obama relies on decades of liberal theories about the utility of arms control agreements and so-called confidence-building measures. Conservatives, going back at least to Reagan, but actually before, don't buy into these theories at all. And finally, and this is something actually very particular to Barack Obama, he doesn't care all that much about human rights. Witness how he neglected the Green Movement in Iran because he was so anxious to get a nuclear deal with the Iranian rulers. Again, going back to Reagan, conservatives believe that human rights and national security go hand in hand. Now, that's the quick overview. But I think what matters most of all in this is a single operational principle that tends to unify Obama's ideological predilections plus his political self-interest, at least as he views it. And that is his aim, his fundamental aim, is to reduce the U.S. role in the world, to minimize U.S. direct involvement in world affairs, especially military involvement and especially direct military interventions. This is sort of a unifying theory, if you will, a theory of everything, if you will, that touches on and explains almost all of Barack Obama's tactical moves in foreign policy. It is a constant in a sea of tactical and political variations. Now, how is this revealed in the Iran agreement? Well, as I mentioned before, obviously one is that an engaged Iran will be supposedly a more responsible Iran. Maybe it will help us defeat ISIS and stabilize Iraq, the president believes. And maybe Russia will do the same if it gets involved in Syria and starts striking at ISIS. In other words, if Iran and Russia do more, we can do less. In other words, we can disengage in the name of engagement. Diplomacy will somehow triumph over military conflict, and if Americans, maybe they can't come home, at the very least we can stay out of the way of other people's problems and civil wars and the like, and somehow it'll turn out okay in the end. Obviously, most conservatives believe this is a pipe dream. The bottom line difference is that conservatives see this kind of engagement as actually emboldening foes rather than deterring them. It makes them more formidable, not less so. Now, a lot of these differences have to do with how liberals and conservatives view American military power, as I mentioned. Essentially, the president has virtually no use for American military power as a backdrop or a backup to strong diplomacy and U.S. leadership. Now, he bows to this rhetorically now and again in perfunctory ways in speeches that are mostly written by the staff at the State Department or the Pentagon, but you can often tell that his heart's not really in it. He tends to dismiss the residual effect of U.S. military power as a support for diplomacy, mainly because he always sees it as a potential invitation to get into a military quagmire, one of his most favorite words. You can even see this attitude in the president's recent dismissal of the importance of Russia's military escalation in Syria, where he said that Russia is going to find itself in a quagmire. This is mirror imaging at its worst. It's not trying to really look at how Vladimir Putin views his own interests and what he's trying to do and get inside his own head on his own terms. It is a preconceived view of the world based upon the president's own, mainly academic experiences, and then projecting that onto our foes and our adversaries and assuming that they will operate and think the same way that he does. This is used to be called the Vietnam War syndrome. It's now the Iraq War syndrome. It's a Vietnam-Iraq War syndrome. It's all these syndromes where the United States has had failures in international affairs, and we learn some lessons correctly from it, but we also often learn the wrong lessons. In this worldview is forgotten in the long pull of American history. We forget the lessons of U.S. isolationism in the interwar period. We forget the lessons of World War II. Forgotten is the role of American power in reconstructing the world order during the Cold War, after World War II, and dismissed is the utility of American power in helping to bring down Soviet communism. The president, in all of these cases, the reason why he thinks these lessons are frauds or untrue or mistakes is because he is steeped in a school of thought that, Colin, you will know very well, historical revisionism. He truly believes in an alternative universe of deconstructed reality, where academics have been spinning alternative theories for decades about why American power was and still is the cause of much of the world's problems. Now, this view of American power, I think, explains why the president is so cavalier about the verification procedures in the Iran deal. It doesn't bother him all that much, for example, that there could be a 24-day wait in the inspections of the Iranian sites because A, the deal itself, not the terms of the agreement, is the main goal. B, the president has likely resigned himself to the fact that Iran is going to eventually get nuclear weapons anyway, and it's better that it happens later rather than earlier, certainly long after he leaves office. And C, the Iranian deal has the extra added benefit of nearly completely foreclosing the military option for the United States and possibly for Israel. If you assume, as the president does, that the worst possible outcome for the United States under any circumstance in its relations with Iran is the use of U.S. force, that any action or agreement that forfeits that option is a good outcome. And I think that's the way he looks at it. There's another distinction worth mentioning. The president, the distinction between conservatives and the president, Obama sees no direct correlation between a state's domestic political order and its foreign policy. He believes that regimes that oppress their own people can, theoretically at least, behave in foreign affairs as generously and as responsibly as any liberal democracy. It doesn't matter, therefore, that Iran's regime is controlled by terrorists. He still thinks that if there is enough engagement of the United States with Iran, they can behave just like Sweden and Norway. Conservatives do not believe this for a minute. They believe that oppression at home often manifests itself in oppression and aggressiveness abroad, especially for big powers, because dictators are illegitimate at home. They must challenge the liberal international order that we've had a big role in setting up that enshrines the values of democracy and freedom. And those values are a direct threat to Vladimir Putin. They are a direct threat to North Korean regime, and they are a direct threat to the leaders of China and a direct threat to the leaders of Iran. And so there is a correlation between the nature of the regime and their foreign policy. They have to challenge the liberal international order because they must be disorderly in international affairs. They must be revisionist. They must be disruptive, because if they don't, then that order is going to enshrine a principle of government and democracy that will threaten them at home. I do believe that this explains a long ways how Vladimir Putin thinks of Ukraine and Syria. Now, there's a political side to the president's worldview that I think bears some mentioning, given, Colin, what you said about the opinion polls. I think that the president's ideology in foreign policy has been convenient for the times in which we live. Traumatized as the nation was by the Iraq War, the president's sort of do less philosophy has resonated for many years. At least he got elected twice. And frankly, not only in liberal circles, but even in some quarters on the right. For one thing, in politics, the easy answer almost always trumps the hard one. The president's tendency is to offer easy answers to problems, that things will get better if we do less, if we simply get out of other people's problems. It is a lot more politically attractive than saying, well, we actually need to do more, we need to spend more, and also we need to risk military intervention. That's like the problem liberals and conservatives had for years in domestic policy is like, well, you want to cut somebody's programs and buy airplanes. Which is more politically popular? I think the president had an easier sell, if you will, with the American people. But for another, and this goes to the point that Jim Carafano was talking about the nature of realism, the president has successfully been able to hide his appeasement policies behind a mask of realism, caution, and pseudo-sophistication. Realism is supposed to be a conservative thing, as Jim said. It's supposed to be a Republican way of seeing the world. But because of the backlash over the Iraq War, the president has been able to define the image of realism to accommodate his brand of liberal internationalism. In other words, he's been able to sell the retreat of American power as a realistic response to the world's problems. Now, make no mistake about it, President Obama's realism is not Henry Kissinger's realism. It's not about adjusting the balance of power or carefully matching means and ends, as Kissinger would see it. Rather, it's an excuse to pull back from world leadership. It's a pretext for retrenching American power and pulling back on American leadership. Now, Kissinger and other realists are cautious about the exercise of American power because they value it and they fear it will be squandered. The president is cautious because he believes exercising American power is actually what causes some of the world's problems in the first place. Now, politically, though, for most of his presidency, and I think it is changing over the last year or so, this political posture has unified America's liberals behind the president, but it actually has divided conservatives. Conservative realists and some libertarians are not left with much of an argument against Obama because they sometimes share some of his assumptions. And as for those other conservatives from the Reagan era that are left over, they are all painted as neocon militarists who simply want to make war all the time. They kind of get reduced to military interventionism as the only thing that makes them conservatives. Now so therefore what's happened is the political space for challenging Barack Obama's redefinition of foreign policy has shrunk because of his successful redefinition of realism. In reality, I don't think it's realism. It's really passivity, retrenchment, and disengagement. But the image of it is that it's sophisticated, that it's cautious, and he's being realistic. He's not doing what George W. Bush did by sort of helter-skelter going into wars. And that contrast has politically served him fairly well. I don't think you can explain any other way than based on what I just said how the president made my way or the highway to war argument on the Iran deal so successfully. Because the military option had been so discredited, conservatives lost the argument that tougher sanctions and the threat of military intervention would actually produce a better deal, which is precisely the way many liberal Democrats and conservatives have been looking at Iran as a bipartisan consensus for decades, and somehow that consensus fell apart. And so when I would find myself out saying, well, wait a minute, sanctions are what brought the Iranians to the table. And we always had the threat of military force as an option. To ever take it off the table was both Democrats and Republicans said that. Well, the president even said it occasionally, but doesn't really mean it. Right. But what's happened is it was definitely taken off the table, and sanctions are being taken off the table as a result of the Iran deal as well. And somehow, miraculously, Iran is going to convert to become a liberal democracy, if not in reality, at least in the way it behaves internationally. This proposition a decade ago would have been laughable. No foreign policy expert would have given it the time of day, and yet now it is pretty much U.S. foreign policy. Now, a final word in conclusion about what all this means. And I sort of made this point down, Colin, before you made your points, and so it's going to sound like I'm disagreeing with you, but I'm not really. Just hang on here. I think that conservatives sometimes underestimate the success of President Obama's foreign policy politically, not in reality, but politically. For one thing, he's left the United States in a very deep hole, and the next president, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, is going to have to dig out of this hole. And that means that anything that president does is going to be extremely difficult and politically costly. And so if it's a Republican president, digging out of the hole by changing any of the policy that the president has established will be attacked by the Democratic Party as, well, it's going to fail, and we can't do that. It's adventuresome, it's risky, it's aggressive. And so the divide that you see right now will exist in a very exaggerated way if you have a Republican president. Also, I think the world, unfortunately, has got acclimated to Obama's way of dealing with the world. And not only has it emboldened our adversaries, so we'll have a tougher road to hoe with Russia and China, some of our allies are already starting to think that they may be on their own as well. So if your president tries to turn this around, he will be accused of upsetting a new international order that the president has actually helped to create. And it's true, I think, that some of our allies would welcome the return of American leadership if it happened, but not in all instances. Not in all instances. Take, for example, how difficult it would be for a Republican president to reverse the Iranian deal. Our allies and much of the world would blame us for walking away from the Iranian deal, not the Iranians. And as for the American people, they've been told time and time again they can have it all. They can have the benefits of security and prosperity on the cheap and with very little risk. No sacrifices are required. Great diplomacy. And will neutralize the threats from our adversaries, multilateralism and the like will solve our problems. And then in that environment, along comes the conservative leader says, no, that's not true. It will cost more money to build our defenses. We must endure the risks of confronting our enemies. We must even consider the use of military force in some instances. And at that point, one of the nation's parties representing the worldview of the president will say, no, it's the wrong way of doing things. You got to do it the way President Obama wanted to do it. So some Americans will balk in the light of this. Now, perhaps I'm being too pessimistic. Maybe the situation has gotten so bad that nearly everyone will see the need for a different course. This is sort of what you're pointing to. Putin is using military force in the Middle East in ways that you really did not even see during the Cold War. He's annexed Crimea. He's subverting Ukraine. He's frankly threatening NATO and the entire post-Cold War system of stability in Europe. Abbas has walked away from the Oslo Accords, and he's pursuing Palestinian statehood inside the United Nations, basically unilaterally, what happened to all of those engagements of the Palestinians and the Israelis. Cuba has stepped up its arrests of dissidents in the wake of our reestablishment of diplomatic relations. China continues provocations in spite of a great honor of a state visit. Kunduz has fallen in Afghanistan. ISIS is nowhere near being defeated. And did I mention that Iran now has a glide path to a nuclear weapon in at least 10 or 15 years, all with the ostensible approval of the United States and the international community? Now, maybe all of this will be a wake-up call for Americans in the next election. Maybe the easy button path will be finally seen for what it really is. It's a way to a much costlier and more dangerous threat to the lives and prosperity of Americans. But who knows? You know, stranger things have happened. There was once an election in 1980 that did turn around.
Thank you. So if you have questions, if you'd raise your hand, and I would recognize you and wait for the microphone to come. So while I'm waiting for it, I have two kind of clarifying things that I just wanted to ask. So one is will or can the Iran debate represent this kind of touchstone of choices in the next election? One, because I think both you guys agree that whether you like or oppose the deal, that is really a reflection of kind of these two contrasting worldviews, and there are really kind of few foreign policy major events that we've had that do it with such absolute clarity, absent, you know, something else happening in the next 12 months. And the other is it's very unlikely that the benefits that some people believe will be realized, or the costs that some people will realize, will actually kind of unfold over the next 12 months. So it'll be kind of the unanswered question. So is it right, and will it actually be a touchstone for the foreign policy debate?
Yeah, I think it will be, because sometimes you have a foreign policy controversy where it turns out to be surprisingly uncontroversial, because a year or two later the nominees from opposing parties actually take the same position. So you don't get much of a debate, right? If you think about it, in the 60s, Vietnam almost tore the country apart, and yet Nixon and Humphrey weren't all that different. If we'd had somebody like an anti-war candidate in 68 like McGovern, then you would have had a bigger debate. I think Iran next year is going to be a debate, because any likely Democrat nominee, they've all indicated they're going to defend it. They're going to defend the deal. They're going to say, this is a good deal, right? And they'll try to sound, all nominees from both parties will try to sound nuanced and sophisticated in the way they talk about it, but essentially the Democratic nominee is going to defend the deal. Any Republican nominee is going to critique it and is going to say this is much more harm than good. And it's going to be a very sharp distinction in that way, and it will sum up a lot of the essential differences, accommodating on the one hand versus a sort of counterpunch on the other. I think so.
Yeah, I think that if, say for example, if the agreement started falling apart, that could result in some kind of a reconfiguration of the politics of that's not going to happen before the election. Most of the milestones in the agreement where sanctions are actually lifted are months into the future. And so when the election happens, it's pretty much, I think, going to be where we are right now. So that we'll have the debate that you just described. The real question for me is that what happens in 2 or 3 years' time when you have another president and the flaws of the agreement start becoming obvious. That will be a challenge for particularly for a Republican president, if you have a Republican president, because at that point there'll be two arguments. There'll be one, why don't we just wait until it falls apart so we'll have the political support to get rid of it, versus no, it's a terrible deal, we need to get rid of it on day one. Because it's a tactical political problem that will have to be navigated if you have a Republican president.
Right. And of course, the argument, President Obama would argue, well, if it's falling apart now, it's because of the stuff you did.
Right, exactly.
No, right.
Absolutely.
No, the argument. It's not, I left you a good deal and you guys just screwed it up.
That's right. If you get out of it, you will be blamed for it.
The other question, I thought, I've been listening very closely, and I kind of get the argument here is that basically what you're arguing is the choice is really between a liberal foreign policy and a conservative foreign policy, and then actually, because of the way the politics in America have evolved over the last few decades, almost aligns with the political parties. But so here's the question I have is, what do you do to characterize people that are often associated with, sometimes with conservatives, often associated with the Republican Party, whether you call them libertarians or different degrees of realists, who argue against all the methods of Obama. If you went to a libertarian or kind of a good Henry Kissinger realist and you said, "Oh, we're going to have the UN do it," they'd laugh at you, and they'd say, they'd laugh at all the instruments, right? But yet they would agree with some of the policies, because their assessment is, well, we're weak and we can't do that, or it's irrelevant. And so it seems still you've got this group of people who largely seem resonant on the right, who appear not to fit in the paradigm here because they're neither kind of fish nor fowl. I mean, can you talk about that? But are they a third choice, or are they just a marginalized aberration that we ignore, or what do we call them?
I don't know what to call them, but they've always been there. Kissinger realists have been around since the 50s and the 60s. In many ways, Ronald Reagan's more muscular approach to the Soviet Union was a direct assault on Henry Kissinger's détente policies. And so these different ways of seeing the world have existed inside the Republican Party for a very long time. I think what's different now is that in whatever this era that we exist in, a post-Cold War, whatever era we're in right now, essentially what's happening is many people who call themselves realists, just like Henry Kissinger was, who thought that the United States really couldn't confront the Soviet Union directly, that we were overextended, that we needed to find a sort of halfway solutions, which Reagan and other conservatives says was propping the Soviet Union up. Those arguments are there in a different form now, but it's largely about how far does one go in confronting the big powers, Russia and China. Kissinger's very, very concerned about confronting China. Many of the realists that you would find around Washington don't want to confront Russia. They're looking for spheres of influence agreements where maybe we could ask Putin, well, what do you want in Ukraine? And maybe we can reach some kind of an agreement. This kind of accommodationist, if you will, philosophy has existed in the Republican Party for a very long time. And so now it's essentially just resurrected. But what the difference is that you now have it not being all that different from at least in practice.
Right.
And the disengagement policies of what Barack Obama wants to do. The ideological motivations are entirely different. As I said, Kissinger, he cares about American power because he just doesn't want it squandered.
Right.
He doesn't really doubt it. He just doesn't think that you need more of it, and you need to be effective. So it's a different way of looking at the world, but it's kind of hard to distinguish if, for example, you're a so-called realist and you say, I like the Iran deal too.
Right.
Or, why, I don't want to give arms to the Ukrainians, so let Putin have Russia.
Right.
Well, that's essentially Barack Obama's position.
Right.
And so however they came to that conclusion, they're ending up in the same place.
Did you want to add to that?
Sure, Judge. I'll just mention the book that I wrote that came out this year, Jim mentioned, called The Obama Doctrine. I have a chapter on differences among conservatives. There's no question there have been factions. I mean, the Obama era has allowed for a lively, wide-ranging debate. And there is one group within the Republican Party, that is non-interventionist. I wouldn't even call it realist. I would say it's non-interventionist. The belief that just really the less we do, the better. The less we intervene, the better. The less we spend on defense, on foreign aid, the better. And that goes back to Taft, not Kissinger. That's not Kissinger.
That's Taft.
That goes back to Taft and
That's
a tradition of on that side.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that moment has passed. I mean, there was a high point for that faction, which was probably 2 or 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you think about Senator Rand Paul, the most interesting man in American politics, right, on the cover of Time or Newsweek, something like that. It is, that argument is not catching on in an era where you have the rise of ISIS, Russia moving into Ukraine and Syria. So that group is never going to go away, but I think that moment, for now at least, has passed.
Yeah. So we have just a few minutes. Other questions? So yes, sir. While we're getting the microphone, let me just get one other thing on the table too, just to emphasize, because you point out that moment, rise and pass, which is this kind of, there is, within these two choices, there's a lot of movement in American polity. So Kim said, well, look, it's like the welfare state. Okay, we have this welfare state. It's completely unaffordable, but it's cushy. Or we could have a free market. Well, give me the cushy welfare state that's unaffordable, right? So this notion is we have this foreign policy. It's unsustainable, but it's easy. Okay, all right. But Americans don't always opt for that, right? So 80% of Americans were against World War II until Pearl Harbor, and then there's this big shift. we've seen these kind of shifts before, and even now, for example, some of the polling on Iraq, where a couple of years ago Iraq was an anathema, and now there's actually, when you poll on Iraq and Afghanistan, you see more Americans actually willing to commit U.S. troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, something that would have been thought impossible 2 years ago. You talked about the Iran deal, which you said 10 years ago, the Iran deal that we did would have been politically, dead before it was born, but now it just it happened.
Well, the failure has to be clear and obvious and almost traumatic, and then it will turn it around. It was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that ultimately did Jimmy Carter's liberal internationalism in, and also some of the failure of the arms control agreement. It was 9/11 that turned around the policy of Bill Clinton. I'm not suggesting that you need an attack in order to turn it around, but the failure of the existing course has to be either very traumatic and very obvious or sustained.
Right.
And I think that we're certainly on the sustained, where I listed all those failures off,
Right.
and the American people are starting to pick it up. I'm just hoping that it doesn't result in some spectacular attack where we're all sitting around as we did. I remember in this very room on the days after 9/11 where we were talking about what happened. I said, well, we've been telling you this is going to happen someday, and we don't particularly want to be in that position.
Well, that certainly seems kind of to be your point, is there is this sustained belief that the Obama doctrine's just not working, right? That seems to be actually reflected in the data. Sir.
Hi, I'm Raphael Danziger, and I'm a consultant to APAC. So my question actually is about Obama's policy toward Israel. On the one hand, we know, of course, it's very famously, that Obama and Netanyahu are not BFF. We know that. We also know that there are deep disagreements on Iran and on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. On the other hand, the security cooperation between the two countries is actually better than ever, which I hear not only from Americans, but also from Israeli security officials. So how does that fit into your view of the structure of the Obama policy? Thank you.
Well, there's some things that are just simply enduring. They're established into the very structure of American foreign policy. Relations with Israel is one of them. The NATO alliance is another. The special relationship with Great Britain is another. It's institutionalized in the Pentagon, the State Department, and the agencies of government, and also it has broad bipartisan political support. And so even when you have a president that comes in who wants to disrupt that, there are limits on what that president can do. And so you can have the very high-profile spats between the president and the prime minister, and yet things that were going on all along, a sort of permanent government, if you will, can sustain the relationship. And thank goodness for that. That really, Madison always talked about, having complexity in a government and not wanting to disrupt things, and sometimes it makes us frustrated with Congress. The same thing happens that when you have an enduring and permanent institution of foreign policy in a country like ours, where even a disruptive president can't come in and overturn it overnight. It's a good thing.
Sure, I'll just add that this is a good example of where there is bipartisanship in a way. I think that's part of the answer, which is Republicans tend to be pro-Israel for lots of reasons. For strategic reasons, for moral reasons, there's a sense that Israel is a valued ally. But a crucial segment of Democrats feel the same way. So even though most Democrats philosophically support Obama's foreign policy, on the issue of Israel in Congress, you're going to get robust support for Israel from a lot of Democrats as well as Republicans. And that isn't just a reflection of narrow interests. It's a reflection of popular opinion. If you ask Americans, do you feel warmly about a given country or not? And you go down the list, Americans in both parties tend to feel warmly about Israel. They do not feel the same way about Hamas. They don't feel the same way about Hezbollah. So this is a reflection of genuine popular sentiment in the United States.
Just to follow up on that, isn't that changing, right? We see the de-investment movement. You saw the fact that despite the opposition of Israel and that wasn't really a significant opposition to approving the Iran deal. I mean, aren't the parties actually becoming more polarized? That the notion that support for Israel is automatically a bipartisan issue, isn't that kind of changing? It's becoming more of a liberal versus conservative issue.
Well, I think the president did his best to nudge it in a direction that would, I mean, the president tried to apply the same logic to Israel that he has applied in general, which is to say, I'm going to try to accommodate U.S. adversaries in the hopes that they will respond. In the case of Israel, he tried to outsource the accommodation. I'm going to pressure Netanyahu to accommodate Israel's adversaries in the hopes that that will lead to some reciprocal benefit. And of course, it doesn't work. But the difference is Israel's a very small country, so you see the costs much more quickly and keenly. So I believe Obama has tried to nudge the policy in that direction, but there's only so much he can do. On the issue of the Iran deal, I was just in Israel a couple of weeks ago, universal opposition, right? I mean, left, right, center, universal opposition, even from people who don't like Netanyahu. But it's understood that, the debate might have actually done some good in the sense that it snapped a certain percentage of people in Congress toward a position of at least having to go on the record and saying, we will support Israel. There are concrete measures we will take to support Israel, and to be vigilant and watch Iran, and watch Gulf allies and support them. Now, I'll believe it when I see it, but it may be moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's some of the anti-Israeli movements and ideas that you find in activists, political activists, intellectual elites and academics, some of the opinion leaders of the Democratic Party, not so much the rank and file that you're talking about. Yes, clearly that is stressing the pro-Israeli position of the Democratic Party, more broadly speaking. And it's opening up space on the party's left for very, very strange and noxious ideas to exist that I'd say 10 or 15, 20 years ago would not have been tolerated inside the Democratic Party. So part of this is the sort of general trend that you see it in all of the opinion polls. The Democratic Party is moving politically and ideologically to the left. It's no accident that Bernie Sanders, the only socialist in the Congress, is the one person giving Hillary Clinton a big challenge in the primaries. Whether or not this will survive or continue, I don't know. But it's the world that we're living in right now, and it's certainly that's the trend that we're facing.
So I think that's an important point, because with the Israel of issue and how you describe that just really brings home is that, so you have the choice between basically liberal and conservative foreign policy, and they do align generally with the political parties, but within them there are stressors. On the right you have libertarians and realism, but on the left you have groups who argue that there's no legitimate use for the force, right? And then some groups who say, well, there are some things that we would use force for, and that's stressing the liberal view just as much as libertarianism, and occasionally stresses the conservative view on the right.
The question though is in which of the two parties are the various wings the strongest and have the most energy and dynamic, and which in controlling the party in the future. Colin, you said that the libertarian moment has passed in the Republican Party.
Right.
There are other strains in the party, but that moment has passed in foreign policy. I don't think you can say that the sort of postmodern left moment in the Democratic Party has passed.
Right. So
I think it's growing.
There's a George McGovern moment still out there.
Well, we all, yeah. Well,
So perhaps if we have one quick question. Yes. And we have 3 minutes for question and answer.
Okay, so is this on? So you keep talking about how liberals, and particularly Obama, are neglecting our allies with this deal, but all of our allies have supported the deal except for Israel. Even inside of Israel, many major people have come out, former heads of Mossad, Shin Bet, really prominent political and economic figures. So isn't there some kind of contradiction in what you're saying, and how is Obama neglecting our allies by supporting this deal that people like Angela Merkel, David Cameron, and Francois Hollande have come out to support?
That's a great question, and it's a good point to end on. So I'll give you both a minute or two to respond.
Well, it's like most things in life. It's not universal. He neglects every ally under all circumstances. The troubles with Israel are very obvious. If you talk to any of our friends in Eastern Central Europe, the Baltic states and Poland, they will talk about being neglected by this administration, not only with respect to the canceling of the ballistic missile defense system, but also their great concern that the engagement of Russia at their expense has hurt their interests. You can see many of our allies and friends in Asia also think that the United States has become too disengaged in Asia. You hear it from the South Koreans, the Japanese, Filipinos, and others. And so there's many instances, and this is what I'm referring to. You're right that as far as the European allies are concerned about the Iranian deal, they have signed on to it. Many of them have a commercial interest. They're lining up to try to get business deals with Iran. They're hoping that the flood of Iranian oil on the market will reduce the cost of energy for the Europeans, to which they are exposed, for example, on the cost of potential high cost of energy from the Russians. So they have their own national interest in this particular interest to sign on to the deal. But you know what? We have allies in the Middle East, too, who don't like the deal. The Saudis are very concerned about it. The Jordanians and other Sunni Arabs, who are our friends and allies, feel neglected and actually betrayed and undermined by this agreement. So it's not a black and white picture, but on the other hand, there is a general trend here that I just mentioned, not only with respect to the way the President has treated allies across the globe, but you even do see it in the case of the Iranian deal with respect to our friends and allies in the Middle East.
King Holland, last word.
So allied governments in the region are against it. I mean, Obama managed to do something quite amazing. He managed to unite Arabs and Israelis against his policy. They don't generally agree on very much. Those are our allies in the region. And by the way, just on the Europeans, the French have made it very clear in public and in private that they were very skeptical about this. But the way they put it is, we can't be more American than the Americans. In other words, if the Americans aren't going to stand up and take the lead against the deal, the French aren't going
Does
to.
that mean we're more French than the French?
Right now, we are more French than the French. And there's you look at the last few years, the French, unlike 10, 15 years ago, are taking the lead in a number of cases against radical Islam and other cases. They are very skeptical in many aspects of Obama's foreign policy.
Okay. Well, I really didn't want this to be like as American, like from France or London, but it's a confusing note to end on. But anyway, please join with me in thanking our panelists, and thank you for coming.